I feel nostalgic about the scene in those days, and sad to see it breaking down. But on the other hand, it was kind of miraculous that this community, which was essentially a 19th century community, had survived so late into the 20th century. That's sort of what it was. It was somehow a time capsule that had perpetuated itself long after the values had disappeared in the country in general.
We did have the outhouse, the back house at the end of the shed. So there weren't all of the modern amenities that we have nowadays. When that facilities changed was in 1970, for my parents. I mean, I had moved out at that point. But, it's memories that, and for a winter night, that was quite a different memory than what children do today. You wrapped up in a blanket and you made the trip and then rushed back to the house where it was warm, and you hurried up, yes.
We always had a lot of fun. We didn't have TVs, radios, or anything, and of course it was very hard to study with just the kerosene lamps. And it was very difficult, but we managed and got our high school leaving and so on, so it was very nice, but we're not able to go on because those days you just couldn't afford it.
I had the problem that every policeman in Lennoxville knew you by your first name and knew your father's phone number. So while you could have a really good time, you knew if you did something bad, they'd know before you did when you got home. But I think growing up in that kind of, I would say even go back to that kind of Mayberry type of town was a wonderful way to grow up. Everybody, it's a very big community. I'm seventh generation in Huntingville, so it's not like we just moved in lately. Our family built the church, built the school, built the 2 original mills. My great-uncle Clifford ran the store for many years.
I can remember a few times, these were in the earliest years, when we went to church. I can remember my mother, we went to church by sleigh. My mother would warm the bricks up in the oven to put on the floor of the sleigh, to keep our feet warm, and we'd have a buffalo blanket. And I can remember at night they would cover me up with a buffalo blanket too, because it would get cool in the house with just wood fires. I can remember the bricks at our feet and the buffalo blankets. Then we're in the very early.
The farmers still had sleighs,
yes.
Horses and sleighs, and they resented this plowing because it meant they had trouble trying to haul their sleighs on this bare road.
It was difficult because before they used to roll the roads.
Yeah. So he said that they were really hostile, and if they broke down, they got no help from the local farmers. There was a kind of adversarial situation.
This I don't remember that because I remember that there were certain periods in the springtime when the snow had gone, and on the what is now the Chemin Cloutier, the one that goes around the river, which was the main road, and that was so muddy there, so terribly muddy, nobody could get through except horses. So when cars or whatever had to go through, we had a team of horses that were there. I don't know whether they were yours or Standish's or whose, and they used to pull the cars through.
Growing up when I was young, the house was like an ice box in the winter, and in the summer, you sweated all the time because it was hotter than hell. It was heated by an old stove in the basement with one big register up. The kitchen had 2 stoves in it, one the cooking stove and one the heating stove. And when you got up each morning, especially in the winter time, you first tried to get both stoves started, and then you made your way down to the basement to start that one. Then you tried to thaw the water pipe out with a candle, and then you took a shovel and shoveled the snow out of the back door because it blew in.
I can remember back to talking about times weren't as easy, or there was not as much money kicked around. I can remember my dad used to cut blockwood, 16-inch blockwood, haul it to Compton for $2.75 a cord. Cord is 4 by 8, cord of wood. So today, it's $100 a cord delivered. Blockwood, the same length of blockwood, the same blockwood is $100 a cord. So times have changed a lot.
I remember back when I was young, my father, when he would take the cream to the creamery in Compton, he'd stop and pick up 2 or 3 of the neighbors' grocery list, and he'd take it out to the grocery store and leave it at the sell-around store, and when he'd then go deliver his cream, come back and pick up the groceries and bring them back to the families. So I think that volunteer work is probably instilled in us from a young age.
At that time, they would put the money in their mailbox, and they would say they wanted so many stamps, and we'd bring it back to the post office, buy their stamps. The next day, we'd leave them in their box. Actually, we delivered all kinds of things. I remember delivering, one time I had some bees that had to be delivered to a farm. And they were supposedly, they assured me that they were sleeping and they weren't going to get out, but they were buzzing quite a bit by the time I got to the farm with them. Another time I delivered 2 or 3 boxes of baby chicks. You could hear them peeping all the way around the route.
At that time, in the early 40s, they had a hockey team, they had a ball team, the community was busy. They'd play towns close by, especially like Hatley, Stansted, Ayrscliff in hockey. And I was pretty young, so I wouldn't be going with them, but they often would hire Murray Thompson's milk truck. It was canned milk at that time, and Elton Whipple was the driver, and they'd hire him to truck them to a game, say in Hatley. And the spectators could go if they wished. Maybe they put in a quarter apiece, I don't know. And they would go in the truck. And they had a wood stove, a small wood stove, and they had a pipe out through the side of the truck, and they'd have a little bit of heat in the box of the truck box. They'd have maybe 25, 30 people in there.
We had the Milby Telephone Company. And then at Huntingville, there's a Huntingville Telephone Company. And the Bell had the system going through the main lines, but all the rural lines were locally owned and operated by farmers. There were 16 families on the line that we had, 8 on one side of the line and 8 on the other. And again, it was how you rang it and how many rings, and told you knew when who was getting rung, and if you were real curious, you could say, oh, what's going on over there?
Nancy, Cindy, Susan, and then Jeff arrived, and that was a big thing because after having 3 girls and finally having a boy, and I'll never forget it because Dr. Wells was the anesthesiast, and he meets Milt out at the nursery and saying he's got outdoor plumbing. So that's how we knew he had a son.
Lots of Swedish people here one time. And in fact, for the 1st of July, I think maybe 3 years ago now, we had a float in the parade in Hatley, and my husband made a kind of like an obelisk with all the Swedish names, and I think there were at least 100 Swedish names that were here in Waterville at one time.
I think Mr. Eugene Naylor came down one night and said, well, I think we need a mill here, and it was a real community effort. It was one of the nicest memories. So Eugene went to the Catholic Church in Compton, and they raised a lot of money, and I still have the papers on that from everybody donated $2, and it was a lot of money in '61. Or they would donate a day's work, or they would bring you 1,000 feet of logs. And the other mill was owned by Scalabrini in St. Edward's. Actually sawed a lot of the timbers and things like that, and then it was just like a bee. All the farmers got together, and it was a wonderful community thing.
Being a sculptor anywhere else, it would be people would be suspicious of you. But in Wade's Mills, they'd say, "Hey, do you know Orson Wheeler?" And I say, "Yeah, he was my teacher." Well, because of Orson Wheeler and his success, in the world. Being a sculptor in Ways Mills was considered very prestigious, you know. Probably the only place in the country where, it was prestigious.
Every morning at recess time, one of the older students took the water pail, and walked down to the Cairns Senior House, filled it up, brought it back, and that was our drinking water and our water to wash our hands for the day. At the end of the day, the older girls took turns sweeping the floor, cleaning up the blackboard, and getting it ready for the next day when we came in the morning.
We were on one side of a little fence, and the French school was on the other side. And we were told we couldn't associate. We weren't supposed to associate with the kids on either side. Well, there was this little girl. She lived above me. She lived up the hill, and she'd walk down to my driveway, and she and I would walk up to the school together. And as soon as we got to the school driveway, we'd split. We didn't know each other at all.
And I have to say that our family attended St. James, the last church in Compton. And I went to Sunday school. I was married there by Reverend Roberts. And 4 generations of our family were married in St. James, the last church in Compton. My grandparents, Alvy and Ethel Brown. Our parents, Clarence and Edna Huff. My husband and I, and our daughter, Barbara and Walter. So St. James is very dear to our hearts.
My father-in-law used to be milking cows at night, and the election was going on, and he'd be into the house with his ear in the battery radio, and he'd listen for a few minutes, and then he was back to the barn, and then he'd listen to the radio and back to the barn. I'll never forget that as long as I live.